Hello and welcome to this Noble Science of Defence training video. I'm Chris. Today I've got Sam with me to help, and in this video we're going to look at the four grounds. The four grounds given to us by George Silver are judgment, distance, time and place. These are the most fundamental element of any fighting system. What I like about George Silver's presentation of these is the way he describes them. Through judgment you keep your distance. Through distance you take your time. Through time you find the place. So we'll initially look at the very basics of it. Judgment is very difficult to visually represent in a video. I need to be aware of my surroundings, I need to be aware of my opponent, I need to be aware of myself, I need to be aware of my weapon, my opponent's weapon. I need to know who can do what at any given time. I need to know, is the ground uneven? Am I going to fall if I move this way? I need to know, has my opponent got 20,000 pikemen behind them? So moving in is probably less than safe. Is my opponent trying to encourage me to do something? Am I trying to encourage my opponent to do something? Are they behaving the way I've asked them to? Am I behaving the way they're asking me to? It becomes very complicated. But a breakdown into this instance is the judgment is simply of distance, time, and place. So we'll keep it that simple. Judging distance as a human being should be fairly easy. Your eyes are mounted on the front of your head and they focus into a point. This is because you are a hunter. As any other hunter, you have the ability to judge distance and calculate it ridiculously small amounts of time. The first is judgment of distance. I'm standing here. Can my opponent reach me? Yes, is the answer. Judgment of distance. Can my opponent reach me? Not immediately. So now I know that my opponent must take at least one step to be able to strike me. Judgment of distance. Can my opponent reach me? Not even nearly. Many steps before they can get to me. In the terms of judgment of distance, this is a distance that I quite like. I can take a guard, but here I gauge that my opponent is going to need at least 3 steps before they are striking me. Come strike me. 1, 2, 3, boom, 4. So 4 steps, which of course gives me lots of time. So I have judged the distance is long, the time is long, and so I don't need to panic. This in particular is why we use our first distance. We have it at this distance. This is for us the first distance at which I am in a fight, that my opponent is a threat to me. But they must take 2 actions. So now I have the opportunity to judge that distance. If they take 1 step, now I am judging that they are closer and I really need to start acting, and I might adjust the distance myself. This also then comes into time. At this distance I have 2 actions or 2 times before my opponent is striking me. 1, 2. And so I have the time to make decisions. So back from that first distance. 1, 2. So I can interrupt the time. And then of course I use this to find the place. As we did there, my opponent makes 1. If I allow them to make 2, then they are in the place and can strike. Or my opponent makes 1, I take 2, and that puts me in the place to strike. So judgment of distance, judgment of time, and therefore judgment of place. However, as I mentioned, the way George Silver mentions it, through judgment you keep your distance. In a modern vernacular, to keep your distance means to keep away. My opponent moves in, my opponent moves in, my opponent moves in, my opponent moves in, and I keep my distance from my opponent. The way I prefer to look at this is that I keep my distance. It belongs to me and I choose where that distance is at all times through judgment. I can keep the first distance. My opponent moves in, I move back, I keep the first distance. Or my opponent moves in, I simply sidestep and I keep the distance that they chose, but I decided that that's the distance we're going to use. But now you see I've taken an angle naturally on my opponent. One thing that Silver puts in his certain general rules in chapter 2 of brief instructions is upon the first action of your opponent towards you, slip a little back, and thus you frustrate their measure. So from this position, my opponent moves 1, and I just slip a little back. Now they go to make their second action to make their cut, and all of a sudden they're not quite in measure correctly from that little tiny step back. So I keep my distance where I want it, but not where my opponent wants it, and thus I find the place. In our school we play a little game called Keep Your Distance, in which my opponent is the agent and I act as the patient. My opponent adjusts the distance according to where they want it, they keep their distance, and I adjust the distance according to where I want it, so I keep my distance. My opponent, as the agent, will act first and can do what they like with the distance, and I simply act accordingly to make the distance what I want it to be. Through distance, you take your time. So now we're going to believe that the time all belongs to my opponent. I have the distance, but they have the time. So for example, I've taken this first distance, but because I've made judgment, I also know how much time my opponent has, and now I'm going to use my distance to steal that time from them and to make it my time. I can give my opponent time back, which is a much more important and much more fun thing to do. My opponent moves in and I keep my distance and I take their time off of them. And I take that time not by taking it off of them, but by giving it back. They still have to make 2 actions before they can reach me. So they make 1 action, I steal that distance, and they still have to make 2 actions before they can get to me. Alternatively, I can steal the time off my opponent. My opponent makes 1 action in, I also make an action in, and I have now stolen time from them because they were planning to make a second action because they had to. Now they have to change their minds, and I've stolen their time. Through time, you find the place. My opponent moves in, I move back, my opponent keeps moving in, I also move in, my opponent tries something else, I move in, we get to the point here where I find the place. So I'm not looking to just run straight into the place, because as soon as I run into the place and my opponent has parried, they are in the place and can strike me in the time of the hand. I've gone too close. So I take my time. I take my time from the opponent as and when I need it. I judge the distance, I judge the time that each action can take, and I try to force my opponent to take more time than they would like in each of their actions. Then I find the place, which, very simply, is where I can strike my opponent without stepping in the foot. Judgment, distance, time, and place. Through judgment, I keep my distance where I want it to be. Through distance, I take time from my opponent as and when I need it. And through time, I find the place where I can strike my opponent without moving in my feet. As mentioned, these are the most fundamental elements of a fight. These things exist at the base foundation level of every single fight. If you can manipulate the 4 grounds, then you will win the fight. If you can manipulate the grounds better than your opponent, you've already won the fight. Distance and time in a fight are intrinsically linked. In fencing, in fighting, time and action are linked. If my opponent is standing doing nothing, I really don't care how long they're doing that for. That's fine. If my opponent is making actions, I need to consider what actions they are doing and how long those actions are going to take. Many people like to fight in this range with the tips of their swords engaged. The issue I have with this is that in one action, I can strike my opponent. So that means every action my opponent takes is something that I have to consider and I have to react to. And what you do at this distance is you end up very much panicking about what's going on. If I don't engage my opponent with a plan and then they suddenly make a plan, I've got to react to that. And I've got to react very fast. And I've got to react correctly. So my opponent suddenly makes a plan. And now I've decided this is the best course of action for me. Except it's not. Here. And so I've made a decision on my opponent's plan, but it was a bad decision. And it left me in a weak place. If I judge the time and the action correctly, my opponent makes one action. By the time they're engaged, I know where I want to be, and I now know what is closed, what is open. I know what options are available to my opponent and what they can and can't do. So now when my opponent tries to make an action, they end up lost, because by the time they got to the place where one action is enough to strike me, I had begun controlling that situation. So I don't ever want to allow my opponent into a position where they can make one action and strike me without me having a plan for how to control that action. So that's the 4 governors. Hope it was useful, and we look forward to seeing you in class.